In the late 1960s, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo operated a field study intended to demonstrate how the neglect of a valuable item can often lead to its destruction or theft. Zimbardo, who would later become infamous for operating something called the Stanford Prison Experiment, was a behavioral psychologist who really believed in the value of field study. In this case, he abandoned 2 cars in 2 very different neighborhoods. One in the Bronx in New York City, which at the time was crime-ridden and often very dangerous. The other in a suburban neighborhood of Palo Alto, California. He tasked 2 RAs to observe the cars and record any interactions that may have happened with them. In New York, the RAs didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, people had begun to vandalize the car, first stripping it for parts and then damaging it for no real purpose. Within a day or so, the car was absolutely destroyed. Conversely, in Palo Alto, nothing really seemed to happen. People walked by the car and ignored it. This didn't stymie Zimbardo. He took a different tactic, walking up to the car with a sledgehammer, breaking its windows, and putting some good dents in its side. Once again, the car was left abandoned and observed. Very quickly thereafter, people began to strip the car as well, taking all the valuable parts from it before doing further vandalism. His point that he was trying to make was that people are always prone to these petty acts of vandalism. They just need the right prompts. These observations would have long-standing consequences for the field of criminology, and in particular, demonstrate the importance of the lifestyle theory when it came to the safety of place principle. Let's talk about that. As I mentioned before the jump, Zimbardo's observations would have significant repercussions for the field of criminology. Specifically, 2 scholars, George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, took Zimbardo's observations and wrote an article for The Atlantic called Broken Windows Policing. The 2 had previously been studying community policing and had noticed that while community policing improved the public's perception of the police, it did very little to reduce crime rates. They suspected that other underlying environmental causes were at the root of crime. To this end, Kelling and Wilson suggested that a broken window or other visible signs of disorder or decay, things like loitering, graffiti, prostitution, drug use, etc., would be enough to tell a person or passerby that this was a rough area, an unsafe area, an area where they could do as they wanted. Kelling and Wilson's logical conclusion to these points was that if the neighborhood is policed, that if broken windows were fixed as soon as they broke, then people would be less prone to acting in a criminalized manner while they were there. These observations spurred the broken windows policing movement that occurred throughout the 1980s. Its biggest single demonstration of success occurred in Times Square, New York City, where significant effort was put into cleaning up the appearance of this tourist hotspot. People who were involved in the drug trade, the sex trade, or were otherwise unsavory characters for this new image of New York City were gently, and perhaps not so gently, ushered out of the area by the police service. As a result, Times Square was cleaned up and became what it is today. While this seemed like a successful point in case for the lifestyle theory of crime and deviance, there were some pretty significant criticisms that tend to be overlooked in popular media's discussion of the broken windows theory. Most notably was the idea of displacement. While crime rates in Times Square went down, the crime rates in surrounding neighborhoods actually went up. In other words, the crime and deviance wasn't necessarily curbed or stopped, but rather sent elsewhere, displaced. More critically, the application of broken windows policing seemed to be akin to putting lipstick on a pig. It did very little to address the roots of crime and victimization in New York City, something that was spiking at the time. instead focusing on making it look nicer. Should the public just accept some of the conclusions of the deviant place hypothesis? That is to say, the expectation that some areas are simply more conducive to criminal activity than others? Or perhaps they are a victim of the proximity hypothesis, that some people place themselves at risk by choosing a high-risk lifestyle. When we think about New York City, where people are cheek by jowl, it seems unreasonable to assume that they are intentionally placing themselves in high proximity to crime or criminal actors. Similarly, the places where people live, love, work should not be considered by default places that are criminogenic. As a result, many people who are engaged in victim studies have questioned whether or not broken windows policing has done much to contribute toward the improvement of crime and crime rates in society. Rather, it seems to be an example of making things look better, not necessarily substantively better. That's all I wanted to talk about for today. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class, and as usual, please leave me any feedback you'd like to improve my videos or to cheer me on. See you soon!